So I feel like I know Alistair pretty well because whenever I've come here several times now, I don't know, maybe 3 times or 4 times even, whenever I've come to England over the last few years. And Alistair has usually been at most of my things here, so we've gotten to know each other a little bit over the last few years. So I'm very, very honored to be here. It feels like I feel very touched by being here because I really do love Ramana. And I was very touched to see his picture, and I've never given a talk with his picture behind me like this, so I feel very much his presence here during the chanting and things. So I mostly lived my life as a Christian monk, but I did, as it says in the introduction, I lived a time as a Theravadan monk. For just 1.5 years I did a intentionally temporary ordination. I was actually a Christian monk at the time, so it was a little controversial, but there have been Christian monks and nuns who've done that with Zen. So that was the case I made for myself, that if they could do it with Zen, I could do it with Theravadan monastic stuff. So I did that and got more deeply into the practice. I did Vipassana practice for probably over 20 years really altogether. But that 1.5 years I did a special practice that's known as jhana practice, which is a very concentrated practice that requires a very monastic kind of environment because it's really deepening concentration deeply. And Bhante Ji was a master of that, so he was a teacher that I worked with a lot. I'm going to be talking to you about my relationships with the Buddha, Jesus, and Ramana. And as we were sitting in silence, I became inspired to share a little chant with you that I learned as a Theravadan monastic. And it's basically the translation of it. It's in Pali. Pali is the oldest kind of extant teaching of the Buddha was in Pali, the Pali Suttas or Sutras. And it's very similar to Sanskrit actually, so you get some of the same, very similar words. At the beginning it's like about Bhagavato, Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. So it means basically kind of hail to the Lord, the Bhagavato, like Bhagavan, the Lord. Hail to Tassa Bhagavata, Arahant, the fully awakened one, the rightly enlightened one, the Buddha. And you know, I think that this little chant, it really represents Buddha, Jesus, and Ramana, because I think in some ways they all have a very similar role in my life. They're all kind of the Lord. They're all just like different forms that the Lord takes. The Lord takes all these forms in our lives, you know. And Ramana is one form that takes, but there's many forms that can take and have over the centuries and the years and so on. And really they represent the Lord that really dwells in all of our hearts. We all are the Lord in our deepest hearts. We all are Ramana in our deepest hearts. We're all the Buddha, we're all Jesus. And that's what we awaken to. That's really what awakening is all about. So this little chant I want to share with you just really captures that. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, is just my own sense of devotion to the self really, with a capital S, that dwells within all of us, that we need to awaken to. And that's what the Buddha points to, that's what Jesus points to, that's what Ramana points to in their own way, from their own different traditions with different words, but they're all essentially pointing to the same reality. So this little chant, I'm really singing it to all 3 of them. I'm really singing it to all 3 of them, and we can all, you can just kind of join. It might be hard to learn this quickly, but you can just join your intention and just feel that you're actually singing that to the Lord in your own heart, the self within you. That's what this meeting and that's what all these things are all really about. So I'd just like to share it with you. It goes like this. Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Sangham Saranam Gacchami. So at the end I took refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So we're taking refuge in the enlightened one, the self, the teaching, and the community of enlightened ones. So that's a lot wider than just the Buddha, Sangha, or Ramana's ashram, or the Christian church, or anything. It kind of transcends all of that. So that's what I want to talk today about, how that all came together for me, and the connection between those three, really, in my own life. So I started out in life as a young Irish background Catholic. My father was English. My grandfather's from Manchester. I'm only third generation, actually, American, because my grandfather was from Manchester, England, and my grandmother on my mom's side was from County Cork, Ireland. So I'm really very UK person, pretty fresh off the boat, really. And when I was in the French community, they all said, "Oh, you look so English." Everybody thought I looked English all the time. So, and they were always surprised when I would speak and I had an American accent instead of an English accent. So. So I really love the UK. I feel kind of at home here and somehow in a deep way. So I started out Irish Catholic, being raised by a mother who was very, very devout and went to Mass every day, was very charitable, did a lot of help the poor all the time, was just raised to be that way. And her sister was a Carmelite nun, so I was around a lot of very, very spiritual people my whole life. It's a great kind of karmic inheritance I got. Why, I don't know how I ever deserved it, but I had a wonderful kind of life of just being around very holy people my whole life. It's a great advantage, you know. And so when I grew up with a great devotion to Jesus and feeling very, very close to Jesus. Even as a little child, I remember hearing stories about Jesus, and for me, they brought Jesus to life. I would hear these stories about Jesus talking to the children, talking about the birds and the flowers, how we should be like the birds and the flowers and not worry and trust God for whatever we needed, how he'd heal the sick and raise the dead and go around doing good, went about doing good. So I had this kind of idea of Jesus as being this wonderful, kind, gentle Christ being that really radiated this kind of light in the world. And that's how I grew up. And I remember going into church one time and my one aunt saying to me, we went to benediction. Those of you who are Catholic know benediction is when you have the Blessed Sacrament, which we believe as Catholics has the true presence of Christ in it, the Eucharistic bread. And they put it in a little golden kind of container called a monstrance, and they put it on the altar, put candles by it, and they sing hymns. It's very devotional kind of thing. And I remember as a little kid, probably only 3 years old or something, and I said, what is the gold crown up there? I thought it was like a crown. It looks kind of like a crown in a way. And my aunt said, oh, that's Jesus. That's Jesus up there. And I suddenly felt this something within me, you know, kind of joyful feeling. I felt it when I came in here, actually, and saw the picture of Ramana. Just this feeling of presence, you know, that as a little kid I didn't know what to make of, but I knew there was something holy there, and something was present there, and the Jesus that I'd heard about, I felt somehow was present in the church. And after that, whenever I'd go into church, I'd feel this sense of presence, like, okay, this special presence of Jesus or the Christ, it's here somehow. And I felt that even in my young little kind of way, you know, without any kind of sophistication, just simply felt a kind of love and devotion. And I grew up with that, you know, kind of devotion. We had a picture of the Sacred Heart in our house that we would say prayers in front of and things, and the rosary and so on. And so here's this person of Jesus on this picture with this exposed heart and this very gentle face radiating this light into the world coming out of his heart. So it's very kind of always struck by that. I was always very touched by that image of the heart. And to this day, if I just see a heart, like just a kind of gross image of a, you know, heart, like a Valentine heart, there's something in me that feels something. I feel a kind of devotional feeling almost, because I think somehow early on I just had this sense that it's all about the heart. The heart is all important. The heart is at the heart of all of it, you know. And so that was the way I was brought up, with all this devotional sense of Jesus, the heart, the Sacred Heart, the Divine Heart, But feeling in a way that it was a little elusive, you know. I'd go into church and sometimes I'd feel it and sometimes I wouldn't. And I always wondered, you know, why is it that it seems to come and go, this presence, you know? It's so beautiful and loving and kind, and I feel it, but I can't seem to grasp it. I can't seem to hold on to it. It kind of visits and then it recedes, and it visits and recedes. So I got very fascinated with that, and very struck that my whole life, you know, we learned in our catechism that the whole purpose of life was to love God and to serve God, and that was everything. And I felt that very keenly, even as a little child. And I remember just feeling like, you know, the only thing that makes sense in life is seeking God. Like my Aunt Ruth, who was the nun. All she did was pray and make altar breads and make vestments, and she prayed all day. That was what she told me. What do you do all day in there? You know, he'd ask her, what's that all about? Say, oh, we pray. That's what we do. We pray for the whole world. That's why Carmelites exist. They exist to just pray for the whole world. You know, and there was something about that that really struck me, and it seemed very heart-centered. And she was very heart-centered person, as was my mom, just very loving and kind. And so those are my images kind of as a child of the heart, the sacred heart, the divine heart. But feeling in a way that it was outside of myself. It was this beautiful kind of presence, but somehow I couldn't always feel it when I wanted. It would kind of visit me unexpectedly. And there it would be. Suddenly I'd be in the presence, you know. And I never knew kind of what to make of it. How do you keep it here, you know? How do you keep that presence? And then early on, probably when I was, I'd say 12 or 13, my mother started getting involved in the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. Some of you probably know what that is. It's like this kind of Pentecostal style revival kind of thing that swept all the Christian churches in the late 60s and all through the 70s, and even today it's still going on in the 80s. It's kind of got more contemplative, more quiet. But at first it was like lots of singing in tongues and healing and visions and all these things. And it was also very, very heart-centered. And we would go to these big charismatic conferences. I remember like in Philadelphia and Cleveland and different places, and you'd go to a hotel and you'd have all these meetings in a big auditorium and be all these people singing and clapping, and it's very happy clappy kind of thing, you know. And so I'd feel as this little kid, you know, and I was 12, 13 years old, and I'd feel this presence. I'd feel this presence again, this joyful, loving presence. And yet it was the same. It was just elusive. You know, I'd feel it in the presence of all these people singing these joyful songs and singing in tongues, which always sounded like this kind of heavenly cacophony of angels singing. It was, you know, tongues, speaking in tongues is like a phenomena you get. It's actually in all the different religions, including Hinduism. There's phenomena of what they call glossolalia, which is ecstatic utterance, just people having ecstatic utterance in prayer and so on, spontaneous. And it sounds like a different language. I'm not sure what to make of it psychologically or whatever, but that's the way it sounds. And in these conferences, we would what they call sing in the Spirit. So everybody would just take up their own heart, and there'd be all these harmonies and counter harmonies and melodies just blending together, and the musicians would be playing kind of spontaneously on violin and guitar and piano, and it was this beautiful kind of harmonious sound. And I used to think, oh, that must be what heaven is like, all the singing, you know. And so, I'm sorry, I'm very, very touched to be here.
That's all right.
So I would feel this sense of love, this sense of presence. And yet, again, it would come and go. It never seemed to stay. And then by the time I got into high school, I really, a teacher, as you mentioned, told me about Thomas Merton. And I went down there when I think I was 16 the first time I went down to Gethsemane Abbey. It was about a 4-hour drive. I just got my license, and I went down, drove down there. My parents let me drive down, and we went down actually with the teacher, the English teacher. He took some of us down, the students down. And so I went there. He had told me about Thomas Merton. I'd been reading some books by Thomas Merton. And I went down there and I saw all these monks in choir chanting in their robes, you know, and their shaved heads and beards and things. And they're chanting these songs, you know. Still beautiful. I still remember, I mean, I was in the Trappist for a number of years, about 20 years probably altogether when you add it up at Mepkin Abbey in Gethsemane. And then a French community I was also in, where he chanted the office. And what struck me was these monks, their whole purpose for living is to live their whole life in the presence of God. And somehow or other, to live in that presence actually is a service to the world. It actually does good in the world somehow. And I was so struck by that, because my whole life there was this theme of wanting to live in God's presence, seeing that as all important. That's kind of what we were created for, you know, to live in God's presence. So when I saw that there were people that devoted their whole life to that, I was very touched by that and very struck and felt very called to do that, even at a very, you know, young age. And I remember talking to the vocation director, and well, not that time. I think the first time I went, I was afraid to talk to any of the monks. They seemed like these strange, you know, mystical people kind of floating around, and I didn't really have the nerve to talk to any of them. But I was very, very moved by the whole experience. And then I started going back, and then I went back any number of times. And eventually, by my senior year in high school, I talked to Brother Giles Naughton, who was also English, actually, and he was the vocation director at Gethsemane. And he was, I remember thinking, oh my God, he's so ancient. He was, I remember now, he told me he was 74. And I was like, you know, I was 19. It was like, sounds like Methuselah or something, 74. Oh my God, he's so old. You know, he might just fall apart if I touch. He looked very delicate too. He had this, he was this little guy, real delicate features, and looked very almost fragile looking. And I remember thinking, oh my God, he's so old. And, you know, and, but I wanted to enter, you know, and I was 18. And he said, oh no, we used to let people come at 15 and 16, but we don't do that anymore. Now we think it's better if you like finish college. And I was so discouraged. I thought, oh, I want to give my whole life to this now. I don't want to wait till I finish college. I don't know, what do I need college for? You know, I want to go live in God's presence. That's all that matters. So, but he had talked me in. He was basically saying, you know, you're not going to come here till you finish college. So I decided, well, I'll go to a college seminary. That makes sense, you know. And we had actually, in Columbus, there was a seminary, very well known, and they sent people from all over the country to go there, called the Pontifical College Josephinum. And it was pontifical because it was directly under the auspices of the Holy See, in other words, the Pope. And it was one of only 4 or 5 pontifical institutes in the United States where you could go and get a degree from a pontifical institute. So I applied. I got good grades in high school, so I applied. They were kind of strict about, you had to get pretty good grades actually to get in. But I got in, and so I went and I decided, well, I'll study philosophy. That'll be a good preparation for the monastery. So I went to the seminary, studied philosophy. I was coming down to Gethsemane practically every weekend. I was so struck at that point. And I started bringing other seminarians down with me. So we'd get the seminary van actually and load it up and head down 4 hours to Gethsemane. And they all found it very intriguing. And a lot of Catholic people, and especially Catholic young men and Catholic young women that are interested in vocations. The Trappists are like the Marines of the church, kind of, you know, they're these tough, really ascetical, you know, strict people that live a strictly contemplative life and never speak and pray all day. And, you know, people that we actually did speak some, and we didn't pray all day, but we prayed a lot of the time. And the whole goal of the monastic life really is to live your whole life in the presence of God. And the whole monastic life is set up to facilitate that direct experience of God's presence. All the practices that we did, the office, where 7 times a day we'd all gather back, we'd all return to the church and say some prayers and chant them in like Gregorian chant. That's all about returning again and again to be mindful of the presence of God, to be just aware that yes, God is present here. You know, so we're going to stop. We're going to go back to church. We're going to be silent. We're going to do some holy readings. We're going to chant. And we're going to remember that God is present in our hearts. God is present. And that was what the whole monastic life was. It was just a constant return again and again to the presence of God. So I entered after college pretty young. And I was the youngest in the community for quite a while. And I entered there. And I'd already read a lot of Merton. And one thing that struck me interestingly about Merton was that he was interested in all these other world religions, which I just hadn't been brought up around that. I just thought, you know, everybody was Catholic basically in my world. So I just didn't really think a lot about it. But I was struck by Merton saying that he felt somehow that all the different religions, he went very deeply into Zen Buddhism, he went very deeply into inter-religious dialogue, and he was really struck by the parallels in all these paths, how they all seemed to be pointing to this sacred dimension, you know, that was within us, really, he would say. And so there was all this sort of emphasis on the commonality of all the world religions, and Merton was a real trailblazer in that sense. So I started out with this great devotion to Jesus, but then I began to realize, well, other people are raised in different religions and they have devotion in different ways, but it's probably pointing to the same reality that my devotion to Jesus points to. Somehow I got that. And I remember as a novice, one day I was working in the laundry and they had this big retinue of people come through. Gethsemane was a famous place because Merton had been there. So we'd often have tours of kind of important people that were interested in Merton, and they'd come and they'd get a tour through the monastery and you'd see them. You couldn't really talk to them because we weren't really allowed to talk that much during the day, but you'd see this big group of people. Father Michael, the guest master, would be showing them through, and you know. So one day I was working in the laundry with Brother Charles folding clothes, and I was a novice. And this big retinue of people came through with this little jolly, heavy-set, little short Asian man in a gray robe and real smiley and going around smiling all over. And I thought, who is that? You know, they come through and he's asking a bunch of questions about everything. He seems very kind of curious. And then I asked Father Michael, who is that? He said, oh, that's Son Nim. He's a Korean Zen master. And he has a little Zen center he started over in Lexington, Kentucky. So he came over, he heard about Merton, obviously, and so he asked his students, could we have a tour of Gethsemane? So they called up and we've given him a tour. So I was very struck, though, by his presence. Again, it was that presence, you know, coming again. I sensed it in him. I could sense, oh, that presence that has visited me my whole life. Somehow he radiates that presence. I felt the joy, I felt the peace, I felt that familiar sense of presence around him and just beaming kind of from him. So I found out about a week later that he had offered to give the monks a Zen retreat. And so I was very intrigued, and I saw the abbot every week and had a little meeting with him. And I said, well, I know I'm only a novice, but can I go to the Zen retreat? I'd really like to go. And he said, sure, you can go. So I was the only novice there. All the other were professed monks. So I went to the Zen retreat, and we sat like for hours and hours and hours. I thought the monastery was strict, and we went to the Zen retreat. It's like, well, these monks don't know what strict is, you know, because you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and you'd eat a little, you know, gruel or something, and then you'd go and sit, and then you'd get up and walk, and then you'd sit, and then you get up and walk, and then you'd sit, and then you get up and walk. And you just did that all day long from morning till night. And then you'd go in every now and then and meet with the Zen teacher, and he would laugh at you and poke you in the stomach with his stick, and that was kind of the extent of it. But one thing he kept saying all through the retreat was, this is all about being mindful. It's all about being in the present moment. So when you sit, you just sit. They call it shikantaza, just sitting. So what do you, and different people asked him. We had several monks over there, probably 15 monks. And then we had Sisters of Loretto that lived down the street. Their mother house was down the street. And about 6 or 7 of them came because they heard about it. So they were there with us in the retreat, sitting, just sitting, shikantaza, just sitting. And I remember people asking him, well, what do you do when you, I remember this sister, what was her name? I still remember, she's such a beautiful, beautiful sister. Can't remember her name. But she would say, well, what do you do? What do you do when you sit? He said, you sit. She said, well, I know you sit, but how do you, I mean, what do you do while you sit? You're supposed to sit in a certain way. Well, you sit up straight and you just sit. And she kept asking him, no, you just sit. That's the whole point. You just sit. You don't do anything else. You just sit. You know, whatever you do, you just do that. When you're eating, you just eat. When you're sitting, you just sit. When you're walking, you just walk, you know. And he had a funny story. He said one time he was at a retreat. He was a little kind of I don't know, you'd call him a crazy wisdom teacher. He's a little unorthodox kind of guy, like a lot of Zen masters. They're kind of like that. And so they were at this silent retreat, he said, and he was at the table, at the abbot's table, which is a different table, because he was the abbot of this Zen place. And he was sitting up there, and at the end, after he was finished eating, I think even while he was eating, that was it, when he was eating, he was looking at he had the newspaper beside him, and he was looking at the paper. He was like eating and kind of, you know how people do, and he's kind of eating his gruel and then looking at the paper and read. And one of the students asked him later, they said, well, you say when you just eat, and when you sit, you just sit. And he said, and there you are up there reading the newspaper and eating at the same time. He said, what's that? And he says, when I'm up there reading the newspaper and eating at the same time, I'm just eating and reading the newspaper. So that's what he was always talking about, mindfulness, just being in the present moment, being in the present moment. And that's what we were stressed on this retreat. You just keep returning to the present moment. When your mind wanders off, you just return to the breath, return to just sitting, return to the present moment. And so that's what I tried to do during the whole retreat. I didn't know quite why, but I thought, well, he's the Zen master, so I'll do what he says. So I kept trying to return my consciousness, my attention to the present moment. And I had every now and then I'd have a little second where I'd feel like, oh, the present moment, oh. And it was kind of like, oh, I get, this is special somehow. It's like all there is, really. I'd get little glimpses. It only last like 1 or 2 seconds, literally, very quick. Then we did that for a whole week, very intense, in complete silence, which we were anyway, usually. So that wasn't so new, but it was a very intense experience. And I remember coming back to the monastery and going to mid-afternoon prayer, and we chanted our little office, only lasts about 10 minutes. And then I went out the door of the church, put holy water on, walked into the cloister, and from one end of the cloister to the other end of the cloister, which was about a 2-minute kind of walk, I was in the present moment. I was totally present. The present moment was just lifting my foot and putting it back down again. And all there was that. And all there was me looking up and the light coming through the long windows in the cloister, falling on the white brick that was painted pure white. The cloisters were very stark at Gethsemane. The church was all pure white and very, very simple and stark. And I remember just being so present in the present moment. For the length of the cloister, I would say 2 minutes. It was the longest I'd been in the present moment at one time. And by the end of the time, I'd made a connection. A little awakening had happened. By the time I got to the end of the cloister, the present moment started to fade a little bit from consciousness, and then I was back in my normal kind of thinking mind, thinking about the next thing I had to do or something. But the thing that stuck with me was all these years, I was 22, so it wasn't like I was ancient, but all these years, it really had been though, my whole life since I was a little kid, feeling that I wanted to live in the presence of God consciously. I wanted to be conscious all the time of the presence of God. And I tried to do that in any way I could, and the presence had come, the presence had went, the presence would come again and then go again. It seemed to be coming and going, And in those 2 minutes, being in the present moment, I suddenly had a kind of eureka or an aha, that's what awakening's like. It's like a little aha, where you go, aha, I see. And what I saw was that the present moment and the presence of God are the same thing. They're not any different at all. This present moment is the presence of God. They're identical. I was calling it the presence of God, but it was really just the present moment. Suddenly that dawned on me and I thought, oh my God, the present moment, the presence of God, same thing. So I was kind of excited about that insight, and it really felt significant to me. And the next time Son Sanim came to do a Zen retreat, I even wrote him before he came, and I said, I discovered that the present moment and the presence of God are the same thing. And he got very excited. He wrote me back this excited letter, and then the next time he came, it must have been 5 months later or something, he came up to me, and the minute he saw me, he came up to me and he goes, present moment, presence of God, same thing, wonderful, wonderful, yes, yes, yes. And he was so excited, And then during the course of that retreat, which as I say, the Zen retreats are very strict. They're all in silence. Even when we ate in silence. Never talked to anybody but the Zen master for about 10 minutes at the most. You know, once a day if you wanted, you could go in. I think it was even less. It might have been 5 minutes. So you had these little, they call them dukasan. You go in and talk to the master, and or you don't talk. Sometimes you ask questions, and he sits there in silence and doesn't even answer you. You know, it's no telling what he might do. Or he might poke you in the stomach. He used to like to poke me in the stomach with his stick. I think because I was just young and he thought I was funny, so he just poked me just to see what I'd do, I think. So I'd go in there and talk to him, but the rest of the time it was silent, you know, and very strict with meditation, sitting, all in silence. And if you made noise, or if you even coughed a lot or cleared your throat a lot, there'd be a monitor come by and kind of hit you with a stick on the shoulder, not hard, but just to let you know, shut up, you know, this is silent. It's supposed to be all silent. This is very, very strict. But every time he would pass me in that retreat, whether I was sitting in the zendo or whether I was eating or anywhere else, he would stop, he would turn to me and look at me and get this big smile on his face, and he'd say, "Present moment, presence of God, same thing, same thing." And he'd go kind of nutty over that. And I was a little embarrassed, you know, because he kept disrupting the retreat with my little awakening, you know, announcing that present moment, presence of God, same thing. But somehow it was a good teaching for me, because it really, really made it clear that, oh, there's really something to this. This is really true. This insight I had is absolutely true, that the present moment and the presence of God are identical. They're really the same thing. So that was a first kind of insight into that I had. And then little by little I worked with another Zen master for a while, Charlotte Joko Beck, who's the founder of the San Diego Zen Center, and she was a wonderful Western woman who worked a lot with Japanese Zen masters and became a Zen teacher, Roshi, herself. And I worked with her, so I did a lot with Zen for, I would say, a good 10 years. And then I got to a point where I was like, well, I think I've learned what I can from Zen. They started me doing koan, which are little enigmatic riddles that you have to sit and concentrate on and solve, and then you got to go in and display to the Zen master your understanding of the koan. And there are things like, does a dog have Buddha nature? That's one. What is the sound of one hand clapping? You know, what was your face? What was your face before your parents were born? They're riddles that make no sense on a logical level, but they try to push you into a transcendent kind of insight. So they go beyond the logic of the mind so that you can grasp truth on some other level that's beyond the mind, you could say. That's what they're pointing at. But I never really resonated much with the koan stuff. I was doing these koans. I'd go in, they'd say I solved them, they'd pass me to the next koan, and I felt a little bit like the 18-year-old guy who's in 8th grade and gets passed because he's just so dumb and they want to get rid of him. You know, it's like, okay, he's been in 8th grade 3 times now, so let's just push him up to 9th grade and get rid of the big lummox, you know. And I kind of felt like that, because I've thought, I'm not getting any wisdom from it. I'm passing these koans supposedly, but I'm not feeling any wiser, I'm not feeling any more enlightened, and so on. But the present moment was less elusive. I would be more and more, because I was doing all this practice of being in the present moment and being in the presence of God and really equating them. So all through this, with all my devotion to Jesus, I still retained that devotion to Jesus, but more and more Jesus started representing for me a symbol. He was like a symbol of the person, a human being filled with the presence of God. That somehow Jesus represented that more and more for me. Still thought of him as kind of outside myself and felt this devotion to Jesus, but more and more I was realizing that Jesus was in some ways a symbol also. So I kind of got to the end of Zen, and then we started having Vipassana teachers come, which are from the Theravadan tradition in Southeast Asia. Zen is more, it's a Mahayana form of Buddhism that you find in China, Japan, Korea, places like that. And then Theravadan Buddhism is more prevalent in areas of Southeast Asia like Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka. Some parts of Vietnam is both Mahayana and Hinayana or Theravadan. So I got very interested in Vipassana. And because I seemed to start, these Vipassana teachers would come and teach, and they felt very peaceful. Again, I felt that presence in them, and I was struck by that. And I thought, well, I want to learn what they're teaching because there's something about them that resonates with me. So I started doing Vipassana practice, and more that sense of the present moment in the presence of God, I was beginning to see, okay, yeah, they are the same thing. And what I've learned in contemplative prayer, in the monastery we learned contemplative prayer, and a lot of it in the Trappists, we had developed a kind of contemporary form of contemplative prayer called centering prayer. But it was based on a very ancient teaching found in a 14th century Christian mystic, an unknown author, English by the way, that wrote The Cloud of Unknowing. And in The Cloud of Unknowing, he basically talked about the sense of God's presence being innate within us. At one point early on in the early chapters of The Cloud of Unknowing, he makes a very radical, interesting statement. He says, God is your being. B-E-I-N-G. God is your being. And he talks about just being present silently with no concepts to your own sense of being. And in that sense of being is God's presence. Your own being and God's presence are the same thing. So, I was very schooled in that form of contemplative prayer. And I began to see that, okay, your sense of being is also the present moment, isn't it? Because when do you feel a sense of being? Here and now, right in this moment, the present moment. And again, this guy is confirming my basic insight that I had some years before, a good 12 or so years before. He said, God is your being. God is your own sense of beingness. A person later on in my life said, the I am, the sense of I am. What is that but the sense of being? Sense of being. When? Here and now. In this present moment. So, things were starting to connect for me a lot. And in the meantime, at Gethsemane and then later at Mepkin Abbey, I was very involved in mostly Buddhist Christian dialogue, but really inter-spiritual dialogue. So we'd have Hindu sannyasi, we'd have Buddhist monks, Tibetan, Mahayana, Theravadan, Vipassana teachers, and many Christian monks and nuns come, and we would kind of compare notes. That's what it was basically. The inter-spiritual dialogue was about monastics from all these traditions who got together and compared notes and told jokes and laughed and just enjoyed each other. And the thing that we began to realize was that, we all have all these different theologies and philosophies and dogmas and doctrines and practices and things, but they're all pointing to this presence, which is in the present moment, which could be called the presence of God, if you like. We all started to see that in these dialogues, and really famous people, like the Dalai Lama, people like that came and engaged. Robert Thurman, who's a great Tibetan scholar, lots of Zen masters, really famous Zen masters, and the famous Zen Buddhist Vietnamese monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, very well known. And these are the kind of quality of people that were engaged in these dialogues. So I was exposed to all these people. Again, it's like this very fortunate karma. I have no idea how I ever, was able to pull that off. But I was exposed to all these wonderful kind of holy people. And so this connection between the presence of God, the present moment, just became indelible in me. It was very clear to me that my Buddhist practice and my Christian contemplative prayer really were the similar practice. They were just pointing differently, kind of from different angles, The Buddhist stuff about emphasizing the present moment didn't seem to have a lot of the devotional sense that Christian contemplative prayer is very devotional, very much a sense of the loving presence of God, feeling the love, feeling the kindness, feeling the tenderness of God's presence. And the Buddhist stuff was a little more dry, it was a little more, okay, that's the present moment, the present moment. They didn't really equate it with God exactly, because Buddhism doesn't really have a sense of of God in the way that Christians and Jews and Muslims have, you know, this devotional quality. But for me, the devotional quality of my love for Jesus and the dedication to returning again and again to the present moment, those were kind of married in me, you know. I didn't really see them as mutually exclusive. I saw them as kind of blending together in my own spiritual life. So the message and the person and the teaching of Jesus and devotion to Jesus and the Buddhist teaching that the Buddha gave of being mindful, returning to the present moment, I began to see, okay, these things are interconnected. They're not completely separate things. They're really actually quite interconnected. So I went for some years with that sense, and I thought of myself as kind of, you know, I was basically a Christian monk, but I had that little stint of that temporary ordination as a Buddhist monk, so I wore Buddhist robes and all that. I went around Southeast Asia with Bhante Gunaratana and helped him. I was like his attendant. So I learned a lot from him, and I practiced in forest monasteries in a hermitage for over a year, just living in solitude and silence and doing this very concentrated practice. And yet, at the same time, even though I was very focused in the Theravada especially, it's pretty grim, it's a little strict and not the most devotional kind of path. But for me, it worked together, the devotion and the mindfulness. I didn't see them as completely separate. And I remember even when we were talking about me ordaining as a Buddhist monk, and I said to Bhante Ji, well, can I be a Christian and love Jesus and ordain as a Buddhist monk? And he said, sure, why not? You know, he really wanted me to ordain because I was one of his prime students, and he wanted to kind of groom me to teach and things. So he was really keen on me ordaining. So, and then in the course of that time, he actually asked me to teach. So I was kind of commissioned to teach by Bhante Ji. And we called him Bhante Ji because Gunaratana, his actual name was Mahathera Henepala Gunaratana. That was his whole, so we called him Bhante Ji, which means reverend. Bhante means holy or reverend. So I made this kind of melding with the devotional quality of devotion to Jesus and the present moment, the presence of God and the present moment, mindfulness being really the same thing. You know, and for me, both those paths, like the message of Buddha, the message of Jesus, they balanced each other out in this beautiful way. You know, the Christian contemplative prayer sort of teaching for me was highly heart-centered, very devotional. And the mindfulness was kind of a little drier and more sort of just focused, you know. But for me, it had this heart element to it because I saw very early on that the presence of God in the present moment were the same thing, not separate things. You know, when you think of it as the presence of God, it has more love and more heart in it. When you think of it as the present moment, it's more kind of razor sharp kind of precision of just being present, just to this breath, just to this step, you know, just to here and now, right now. But for me, like I say, they were married. They blended together. So I was living my monastic life pretty happily. As you mentioned, I left a couple times to take care of my parents. But even when I left at different times, I was still actually in vows. I didn't leave the monastic state, but I went out of the monastery to care for them because they needed care. So I did that. I did the CPE study, which clinical pastoral education. I got my credential to be a chaplain because I already had a degree in philosophy and theology, and I'd gone to the University of Paris in the meantime and gotten further degrees, and so I had philosophy, theology. And then I went and did CPE, which is kind of on-the-job training of pastoral care. And after I took care of my mom, that had been my second leave to help my parents. And during that time, I got to work as a hospice chaplain. And that was a very significant thing for me, you know, to work as a hospice chaplain. And these people that were dying were great teachers to me. Many of them, I talk about one in my book, Mary, call her my Zen master, Mary, because she was just she was a Catholic woman who had been diagnosed with a terminal illness and ended up dying, but she came to this deep place of surrender. And there were many patients like that. There was a little boy named Paul that I had as a patient. He was only 12 years old, and he had leukemia. My brother actually just passed away with leukemia just a week ago or so. And Paul had leukemia. And I remember he was very into Harry Potter. At the time, Harry Potter was very popular and all the books were coming out. He said, he got me reading Harry Potter because I read him because he was telling me the story, and I thought, you know, that sounds kind of Christic almost. Sounds like a Christic kind of analogy or metaphor kind of. And so I thought it'd be good for me to like read those books so I'd have something I could use to kind of an entree into talking to Paul about some spiritual things. So I read the books and I just got hooked on them. And then Paul, as he was actually dying, the week he died, his mother said, called me up and she said, you know, Paul's asking for you over and over. He wants to talk to you. And I knew he was close to death, and I thought, well, you know, he probably has something, you know, about his dying or something he wants me to do. And he did have a few things like that. But then he said, but there's one thing that is really, really important, and I want to make sure that before I go to be with Jesus, and that was the way he talked about it, he said, I want to make sure that you promise me that you'll do something. And I said, anything, Paul, what do you want me to do? Because you've got to read every single Harry Potter book that comes out, and when the movies come out, you've got to go to every single Harry Potter movie. For me, because I can't go, so I want you to go for me. And I said, I'll do it. And I did. I did do it. Even though I was back in the monastery, I asked for special permission. I've got to see the latest Harry Potter movie. So I made a promise on this little boy's deathbed that I would do. So Paul was a teacher, and Mary was a teacher, and all these people in hospice were great teachers for me. You know, so then by the time my mom passed away, I was ready to go back to the Trappist, and I was, you know, still in vows, and I could just have gone back. But by that time, I had had such a rich kind of journey into working in pastoral care, because the Trappists don't work in pastoral care. They're purely contemplative. You go off to a monastery and pray all day, and you don't go out of the monastery except to go to the doctor or something, or if you have to go to the hospital or something. So you don't go out and do pastoral work. So I thought, well, I still want to be a monk, but maybe I should join a Benedictine community where I can actually do work outside the monastery. And so while at one point when I was out, I'd studied at the University of Paris, and I lived with this community in Paris called Fraternité Monastique, monastic fraternity of Jerusalem, de Jerusalem. And I fell in love with the founder. He was this saintly, very charismatic guy, Pierre-Marie Delfew. And he was always keen on me. He said, oh, you'd make a great monk in the city. You should come and join us, and so on. And I said, well, I'm a Trappist, you know, I can't. So, but then when my mom died, I thought, you know, I remembered Pierre-Marie inviting me, and I thought, maybe I should transfer to that so I can still do my pastoral work. So I did, and I was still able to do my pastoral work. And I entered in Paris originally. That was where the first foundation of the Fraternité Monastique was, in Paris. And their ideal was to be monks in the heart of the city. He wrote a little rule of life called In the Heart of the City, in the Heart of God. It's a beautiful little book about their rule of life. And it was all about being contemplatives in the heart of the city. So contemplatives enter into the heart of God, and then they live that heart in the midst of the city where it's really needed, where people need that heart-centered presence. And again, it was about bringing the presence into your life, returning to the presence in order to be a vehicle for the presence. As a monk in the city, that's the way we saw our vocation. So we went around the city, we wore our habits all the time, and we were all working in the city. I worked in parishes with the dying, because I was trained to do that kind of work. And so that was my life in the Fraternité Monastique. And then eventually they made a foundation in Montreal, and they sent me to Montreal, because obviously I was American, so I could speak English and French, and so I was a perfect person to have in this foundation. So they sent me there. I worked with novices. I did a lot of things. By that time I'd been a monk, you know, quite a while, all my adult life basically, and I was in my mid-40s at that point. And so they sent me there, and I remember being in the library one day, running across this little book with his face on the cover, and it was called Who Am I? It was a little pamphlet. You're probably all familiar with it. Years before, in Gethsemane, when I was in my early 20s, I was sitting in the library again, and I saw this picture, photograph of this man with this radiant face. It was that very same picture, but of his whole body. So it wasn't just a portrait of his face, but it was him sitting on a little, I think he might have even been sitting on a leopard or a tiger skin. And I think it's that same exact picture. And I was so struck by his face. I thought, what a beautiful, radiant face. And again, I felt that presence in the face. I could feel that sense of the presence of God, which then I later realized was the present moment. And it was radiating from those eyes. I just felt it strongly, just in the photo. And I looked up and the man died like before I was born, you know. He died. And yet the presence seemed so present in that picture. I was so struck by it. And I thought, I've got to find out about this guy. It was a little odd for me because I was raised in an Irish-English home. And here's this old man sitting in a diaper, you know, with, you know, all his stuff kind of hanging out. And I was thinking, no, all due respect, Raman. And I just thought, oh, that's a little disgusting, you know, this old man with this kind of saggy body, and he's sitting there in this little diaper. And I thought, you know, that's not my thing. But the face I couldn't shake. And I thought, there's something special about this man. There's this presence that I'm feeling transmitted to me through this picture. Of all things. It's just a photo of a man long dead before I was born. What's this about? So I looked up in the library, and the only book we had was the book you have over there by Arthur Osborne called With Little Dust in Their Eyes. And I read, and I loved the parts about his talking to the animals. I mean, my religious name was Francis, so that's where I get Francis. And I loved St. Francis, that's why I took that name. My mom used to read us stories about St. Francis when we were little, and I loved St. Francis because he seemed so much like Jesus to me. He seemed like he was just this great sort of vehicle that just expressed the Christ in his life and loved the animals and loved little children and all the, just like Jesus. And I felt this closeness to St. Francis. So when I read that book about Ramana by Arthur Osborne, I was struck by the similarities to St. Francis. I was like, wow, this is like an Indian St. Francis, you know. He's arbitrating disputes among the monkeys that live by the ashram, and he's doing all these very Franciscan kind of things. He's talking to peacocks and birds and preaching to animals and talking to the little mice that used to, you know, doing all these very St. Francis-y kind of things. And I thought, oh, it's just like St. Francis. So I love that part of the book. But when he got to his spiritual practice, I was sort of intrigued because I thought, well, how did he get to that point? How did he get so radiant? What did he do? You know, what was his spiritual practice? And Arthur Osborne, God bless him, I'm not trying to criticize, it's a beautiful book. But the way he presents Atma Vichara in that is kind of, at least, let's say it this way. This is what I got out of it in my limited, maybe, wisdom at the time. What I took away from that book, and maybe I should read it again and see if that's really what was in it, or what's just what I took away at the time, but was just sit around and ask yourself, who am I all the time? That was kind of what I kind of took away from it. And I tried to do it, and I didn't get anywhere. It was like, this is boring. I'm not getting anywhere. I don't feel any presence in it. It just feels kind of empty. And so I just discarded it, and then fast forward into Montreal where we left off, and I was in the library and I ran across this little book, Who Am I?, in French, and they said it was written by Ramana Maharshi and it was about that practice, Who Am I? And I thought, well, this is interesting because the other book was by a guy writing about Ramana. This is by Ramana. So I want to read this and see what Ramana has to say about this because I'd never read a thing by Ramana at that point. So I read the little book. And again, it was one of those little aha things happened. I read the book, and what I got out of it, what I gleaned out of it from what Ramana said about his practice of I amness, or who am I, that question, was, oh, he's talking about just looking at, resting as, investigating the present moment. Because the present moment is I am. That is the same as the present moment. And oh my God, that's the same as the presence of God. So he's basically saying the same thing that the contemplative practice in the Christian mystical tradition is saying, that you just return to your sense of beingness. And I remembered that passage from the Cloud of Unknowing, which I had studied and taught to novices and preached about and led retreats on and everything else, on centering prayer retreats. So that book was very central to my spiritual life. And I remembered that little passage, that little phrase, I think it's in the second chapter of the Cloud of Unknowing. And he says, God is your being. And I thought, oh my God, that's what Ramana is saying. That's what self-investigation, that's what Atma-vichara is. It's just realizing and resting as your own being and realizing that is sacred. And at that moment, I am not kidding, my whole life seemed to converge in the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the Christian mystics about resting in the heart of being, and that is God's presence. The Buddhist teaching that the present moment, you have to return to it again and again. It's always here and now. And then Ramana's idea, I thought, he's not far from saying God is your being. He's basically saying the same thing. He would talk about it as the I am, your own I amness. That itself is the beingness. That is God. That is sacred. That is divine. It's at the heart, in the heart of every person. And at different points in my life over the years, something every now and then would strike me, and I'd feel a push from the divine within, pulling me in somehow. And Ramana talks about that. He talks about the divine. He talks about the guru on the outside pushing you, and the divine inside of you pulling you. So at the same time, this divine force is conspiring to get you where? The heart, into the heart of beingness, into the heart of I amness, into the presence of God that is the present moment here and now, that's right now, here and now, with all of us in all of our hearts, right now. You know, and suddenly the teaching of Jesus and the Christian mystics, the teaching of the Buddha on the present moment, and the teaching of Ramana on I am and beingness here and now, I suddenly saw they're the same teaching. They're not different teachings. They're different people. They're like different signs pointing to Rome. And all paths lead to Rome, you know. They're all saying, you know, if you come to Rome from the north, you're going to have a sign pointing a certain way. If you come to Rome from the south, you have another sign. If you come to Rome from the east, you can have another sign. And Buddha and Jesus and Ramana were just different signs pointing to that one self that they all are a symbol of. Ramana is not just an Indian man who lived however long ago, who died, what was it, 60 or so years ago?
1950.
1950? Yeah, 60, well, however long ago that was. 60 some years. 65 years.
66.
Ramana was not just an Indian sage and saint who lived and died before a lot of us were born. Jesus is not just a Jewish rabbi, or even the Messiah, or if you believe that lived 2,000 years ago in ancient Palestine. The Buddha was not just a Hindu teacher that then got a new insight and actually had a new religion form around him about 1,000 years or so before Jesus, before the Christ. You know, they are all of them. Buddha, Jesus, Ramana, they're all symbols. They're all, in a certain sense, you could say, incarnations of the divine self. The self with a capital S, which is another name for the presence of God, which is another name for the present moment, which is another name for you and for me. You know, we're all the self There's not just a few special people. Ramana was Ramana, and that's wonderful, and he had his teaching and all that. But I'm sure if Ramana were here in the flesh, he would say, this self that you see manifested in this form, you're that self. It's within you. You know? And yes, we can have flowers, we can sing bhajans to Ramana, we can sing songs to the Buddha, we can sing to Jesus, we can have this feeling of devotion. But what happens in the spiritual journey is a movement. And I had that movement happen in my own life, where I started out with a sense of devotion to Jesus. And I loved Jesus and all that Jesus represented. You know, the gentleness, the kindness, the compassion, the love, the joy, the peace, the patience, the kindness, the goodness. All the fruits of the Spirit in the Christian mystical tradition. We call them the fruits of the Spirit. The fruits of consciousness, you could say. Fruits, spirit and consciousness, same thing. Spirit with a capital S, self with a capital S, consciousness with a capital C, being with a capital B. They're all pointing to the same reality that radiantly shone through Ramana, through Jesus, through Buddha, and seeks now to shine through you and through me. And that's why we're here. That's why we're on the planet, is to live in that presence, to live as that presence. You know, later, after I read that book, I actually had a little, not little, but an experience that unfolded for me right in the middle of Mass. And suddenly I felt this push when I came across Ramana that I need to practice every day for as much as I can. And so when I had desert days on Mondays, we had a day off where we went to hermitages, stayed for a whole day in silence. And I would take this blended practice of contemplative prayer, of Atma Vichara, of returning to the present moment. They were all pointing in different ways to the essence of the practice, which is just to return again to the self within you, your own beingness, and to rest as that. And somehow I felt this push. I'd felt it other times in my monastic life. I've got to go all in on this. I've got to just devote my whole self to this, to doing this in all my spare moments, and when I'm just not doing anything and walking down the street, return to that sense of being and just keep returning. And I'd have times where I'd sit every day for several hours and do that, but I also did it just in my ordinary life, every day, walking around, working in the kitchen, teaching the novices, you know, doing retreats, talking to retreatants, you know, preaching, doing all these things. And I kept returning to that sense of being, which the author of The Cloud said was God, the presence of God within me. And Ramana would say, the self within us. So that's what we're investigating, the self with a capital S. That's what Atma Vichara is. It's gazing at the self lovingly. You know, so can you see how all these different few practices blended together to make a really balanced, nice practice? A lot of people today, unfortunately, in the kind of neo-Advaita kind of movement that you have in the West, they hear about Atma Vichara, they ask, who am I, incessantly. They do all that stuff, but they don't have any of the devotion. Hardly. Many of them dismiss devotion. But Ramana, Nisargadatta, these people that were really woke up from these practices, they had that devotion, you know. Ramana would circambulate Arunachala and sing hymns to Shiva and cry when he'd hear hymns sung to Shiva, because Shiva for him was his Christ. What I took as Christ, it was really a kind of symbol of the self. And so they had this great devotion, and the movement that happens of awakening is we start with this devotion to this figure that we think of as somehow maybe even outside of us, but we move from this journey of intimacy with the sacred as represented in this symbol of, you know, you could say Jesus, Buddha, or in your case maybe Ramana represents that for you. He's a symbol of the self. So you start with that devotion, you sing hymns and bhajans and bring flowers and fruit, and that's beautiful. But eventually, what happens is a movement from intimacy to identification. And you begin to realize the Ramana that I feel all this love and devotion for, he lives in my heart. That's what I realize. The Jesus that I feel all this love and devotion for, he lives in my heart. He's the Christ within me. You know, the Buddha, you awaken to your own Buddha nature in the Buddhist tradition. You realize the Buddha is within. The Buddha is my own being. The Buddha is the present moment. The Christ is, Ramana is, they all are. You are. It's all pointing that movement from intimacy to identification. And so now, what I experience in my own life is, in the way I would put it, and I don't often put it this way because it's not going to resonate with everybody, because it's a symbol that works for me. It's particular to me and it's particular to other people, but it's not for everybody. Some people might have another symbol. But for me, the way I experience the awakening in my life is the Christ living in me and through me. That Christ, that Jesus living in my heart wants to radiate out into the world through my heart in a very particular way that's colored by even my personality. And even saints and sages, you look at Ramana and Nisargadatta, oh my God, two so different people. You know, they both radiate the self in the world, but they do it in their own unique way. I often compare it to stained glass windows. They all radiate the beauty of the sun, shines through the stained glass window. But one is a scene of the Annunciation. The other is the scene of the sacrifice of Isaac. The other is Christ in the garden praying. You know, the other is the Annunciation of Mary. There are all these different scenes with all these different colors, all these different shapes of glass. And yet the beauty of all of them is, the essence of the beauty of all of them is the sun. It shines through them. And it's the same in your life, in my life. The self will shine through you in a way that's never been seen before, will never be seen again. And that's how all these teachings, the teaching of the Buddha, the teaching of Jesus, later kind of amplified by the Christian mystics, and the teaching of Ramana, they all are pointing to the self. And they're all pointing to the radiance of the self. And in closing the talk, before we have our break, I want to share with you a little prayer, and some of you have come to me before, have heard this prayer because I love it. And it's by an English saint, many English saints, possibly in this room. Something about those English, you know. They can get saintly if they're not careful. But this is Cardinal Newman, who was a beautiful saint, wrote beautiful poetry, beautiful prayers. And there's a beautiful prayer by Cardinal Newman that I learned as a child because Mother Teresa prayed it every day after communion. My mother was a co-worker of Mother Teresa, like a lay associate. And so I heard this prayer and I loved it. And when I entered the monastery, I prayed it every day after communion for years and years and years. And it's basically the essence of the teaching that I've just shared with you is in this prayer. It's got the Christ symbol, but if you'd like, replace that Christ word with Ramana or Buddha or Krishna or Shiva or whoever you relate to. So you don't need to think of it as Christ if that's not comfortable for you, but just replace whoever you want when you hear me say the word Jesus or Christ. But I'd like to share this prayer with you because I think in essence it's all about this teaching, which is a perennial philosophy, as Aldous Huxley would say. It's this perennial teaching. It's the, what do they call that in Hindu? The something dharma. That's universal.
Sanatana.
Sanatana dharma. Yeah, that's what Ramana was teaching. That's what Jesus was teaching. That's what their followers can do what they want with it, and they often do all kinds of things with it. But what they were teaching, what they were pointing to, was the essence of this teaching, which is the Christ, the Buddha, Ramana, radiant divinity is within all of us, and the whole reason we're here is to radiate that into the world. So may you radiate this spirit into the world. May I radiate it. May we all radiate it after the example of Ramana, and come to not only honor Ramana and even worship Ramana or feel devotion to Ramana, but to awaken to the Ramana within us, to really be able to embody that in the world in our own unique way. We're not Ramana. you know, and we can't be and we shouldn't be. We're us. But this Christ Spirit, this beautiful radiant divinity will radiate in your life in a very special way that's unique to you, like snowflakes, one of a kind, beautiful. So just join yourself to this little prayer I'm going to share with you, and then we'll have a little break, and then we'll come back for questions and answers or discussion. Okay? So the prayer goes like this. Dear Jesus, help me to spread your fragrance everywhere I go. Flood my soul with your spirit and life. Penetrate and possess my whole being so utterly that every soul I come in contact with may feel your presence in my soul. Let them look up and see no longer me, but only Jesus. Stay with me, then I shall begin to shine as you shine. So to shine as to be a light to others. The light, O Jesus, will be all from you. None of it will be mine. It will be you shining on others through me. Let me thus praise you in the way you love best, by shining on those around me. Let me preach you without preaching, not by words, but by my example, by the catching force, by the sympathetic influence of all that I do, by the evident fullness of the love my heart bears toward you. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes?
You didn't say anything about practice, but how does one actually practice this?
Yeah, I didn't say anything about practice, but I really want to stress that practice is really, really important. I did actually say some things about practice, because I was talking about returning to the present moment, returning to a sense of God's presence, and the sense of beingness. And that itself is the practice. I mean, I could go into more detail about what that means, and in some of the other things I'm doing here in England, like my retreat and things, I will go into that more deeply. But it's just basically returning to the sense of existence consciousness, you could say, or beingness that's always with us. And that is the primary practice, I think, that Ramana was pointing to, at least as I understand it, is that he was talking, just like the author of The Cloud, he was talking about returning to a sense of being, which is also here and now in the present moment. Where else is being going to be but here and now? That's where being vibrates. Its vibration is here and now in this moment. And this present moment is eternal. It's always the present moment. It's never not the present moment, is it? You know, we're never in the past moment. We're never in the future moment. We're always in the present moment. You know? The only time it becomes a past moment is when we're remembering it. And the future is when we're imagining it. But the reality, all that exists is really this present moment, our own beingness here and now. And that's really what all these things are pointing to. So in a way, I hope at least I was expressing that is the practice, and that's what we need to do. And you know, a lot of times I think we think of it as this esoteric, complicated thing. And really, what could be more simple than returning to a sense of existence? You know, we all exist, don't we? Everybody here? Anybody here not exist? Yeah, well, people would raise their hand in some circles. But in reality, we all exist. We're all in a sense of beingness at all times, I amness. So the practice is just returning to that I amness, that beingness. And I'm convinced that the contemplative mystical saints, they're pointing to that. Ramana's pointing to that. Jesus is pointing to that. Buddha's pointing to that. They're all pointing to that. They all talk about it in different ways. You know, it's like giving directions of how to get to London in French or Italian or English or Spanish, but they're all directions to how to get to London. You know, so I think it's much the same. The practice, the essential practice is perennial. It's perennial. You find it in all the religions, you find it in all the paths. They use different words, they point to it differently, but they're all pointing to the same essential reality from my perspective. Does that make some sense? Does that answer your question? Yes?
Your life journey has a lot of love and compassion in it.
And you also talked about the presence of God and the present moment. Now, usually that is associated with this whole idea of nothing exists, nothing is there, and the kind of. So my question really is, can you share some advice on how we can integrate the nothing and the everything in our lives?
Integrate the nothing and the everything. Could you be a little more specific?
Ramana Maharshi says that Brahman alone exists, the world is unreal.
Right. That's from an aphorism of Shankara. The whole aphorism is, the world is illusion, only Brahman is real. There's a third part. The world is Brahman. So that's the full circle of awakening. I talk about it as the full circle of awakening. You've got to awaken up out of the idea that only this physical world is what's real. You've got to awaken to that only Brahman is real. But then it comes full circle and you realize the world is Brahman. The form is taking manifestation from the unmanifest, the formless, is becoming form. That's the whole play. That's the Leela of life. That's all this, all these people, these trees, this place, this picture, these flowers. It's all Brahman taking form, which is essentially the Christian message of the incarnation. It's divinity becoming a human being, but not only a human being, everything that exists is like that. It all flows out of the formless and then goes back into it. So it's all temporary manifestations of the formless. So there's actually, in the full circle of awakening, there's absolutely no contradiction between form and formlessness. There's not at all. It's all what, it is all Brahman, all of it. The form, the formless, all of it. In the Zen tradition, there's an old Zen sutra called the Heart Sutra, the Mahayana Sutra, in which he says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is none other than emptiness, but emptiness is also none other than form. And that's what he's getting at. And see, that's the problem with awakening. Awakening is on a trajectory. There's a full journey of awakening. I call it the full circle of awakening. And a lot of people in modern Western Neo-Advaita, whatever, hocus pocus, whatever, they only get to the first part of that aphorism. They get to, the world is illusion. So a lot of people just stop there. Okay, the world is illusion. Okay, I'm not real. The world's not real. You're not real. You know, Jesus isn't real. Brahmana isn't real. Nothing's real. So it's like, you know, if you just stop there, you want to go behind the barn and shoot yourself in the head. You know, I mean, what's the point? So that's just stopping short, see? You see, okay, the world is illusion. Okay, that's true as far as it goes, but only goes so far. The next part of the aphorism is only Brahman is real. So you've got to awaken up and out of the idea that all that's real is this physical form and the physical world and the material like universe is all that's real. That's what most people walking around the planet, they're in that consciousness. If you're lucky enough to wake up into the transcendent reality of Brahman or God or presence, you say, well, that's really what's real. But then you've got to continue on and embody that in the world in this form. And that's where the world is Brahman. So it's a full circle journey.
So in that sense, perhaps there is not much difference between life as we experience it now and after the complete journey. Maybe a slight difference of perspective, like as opposed to having all the mind games, we just have a more peaceful attitude. Is that what you would say?
What do we care what life is after this is over? What do we care? It's not over yet, is it?
No, I don't mean about like death. I mean like the full circle of the journey that you talked about.
Yeah.
So initially we start off by saying, I don't know what's going on, and then we go with Brahman alone is real, and then Brahman is the world. So well, my question really is, how is life different from before we begin this journey and after we end the journey?
It's hugely different. Hugely different. Life is the same, but our perspective on it, our experience of it is vastly different. Not that life has changed, but the way we perceive it has changed. You know, for example, the human experiences of grief and sorrow and sadness and all that. I mean, my brother just died. I just lost my twin brother, my only living relative. I have no other. My parents are both dead. My brother's dead. They're all gone. So on one level, on a human level, that was very difficult and sad. And yet, in the whole experience of him dying, it was all arising in this vast sea of peace. Honestly, literally. And so there was peace through the whole thing. That doesn't mean I don't feel all the same human emotions, but it's just the context in which they're arising now is so different. You know, I often compare it to if you had a little glass of water and you take a spoonful of dark, horrible poison and you pour it in the glass of water, it's going to overwhelm the glass of water. It's going to be filled with black, thick, dark poison. But if you take the same spoonful of poison and pour it in a vast ocean, it quickly dissipates. It's not overwhelming to the ocean because the ocean is vast. You know, and it's the same when we awaken to who we are on this deep level, that who I am really is this vast consciousness that pervades all that exists. Then the little personal issues of sadness and all that, they come up, but they're in a bigger context. But in fact, when we're in that consciousness, we don't shut down around anything. So we're absolutely unconditionally open. So we even feel the sadness and all that even more tenderly, even more deeply. And yet it's in this, so both are true. It's like, yes, I'm very sad. I miss my brother. I feel grief over his loss. And it's all arising and ceasing in this vast peace. It doesn't make sense on a logical level, and until someone's experienced that, you can talk about it till you're blue in the face and they won't get it. They think it's got to be either or. Either you're completely, you know, dissociated and it doesn't touch you at all, or you're totally caught up in it and it's like, no, and the reality, the full circle reality of awakening is that you're both fully human and fully divine at the same time. So you feel deeply all the normal human feelings, and yet they're arising and ceasing in this vast infinite space. Does that make sense a little bit, at least intellectually?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I can sense the opening of, you know, I can sense as a teacher you're very open in that sense. You know, I have experienced some teachers who just go like, there's nothing, there is nothing, there is nothing. You know, it's driving me crazy. But
a lot of Advaita, so-called, a lot of neo-Advaita, I would say, in the West, is lopsided. It's all looking at the absolute view. But you get somebody like Ramana, you get the Advaita tradition in India, and it's rich and subtle and nuanced, and it understands that the whole human appearance is relatively important. It's not absolutely important once awakening has really come and is abiding, but it's still, it's the Leela, it's the dance. You can't not take part in it. If you go to India, you'll see that. If you go talk to Advaita saints and people in India, you'll see that there's this different, it's not like the Advaita of the West where it's just like, oh, you're just this robot and everything's, you know, oh, there's no me, there's no you, there's no nothing, just like, you know, just do yourself in, because what's the point?
Follow-up was, so once we complete the circle, then we are free to live our life perhaps as it was before.
Well, but with a twist.
Yes, completely.
But yeah, because that's the whole point, is that we want to awaken up to who we are on this transcendent level of the absolute, but we're still embodied in these juicy, interesting human lives. And it's all interesting and wonderful, the unfolding of it. You know, God made it that way. Did God make a mistake? Is the whole world just some kind of big mistake that should never have happened? I don't think so. I think that God, consciousness, Brahman, whatever name you want to give it, created all this for some reason. There's a dance going on, and it's all beautiful and rich and juicy and wonderful. And we've got to transcend it. We've got to get to a place where we realize that's not the be-all and end-all, and yet we can enjoy it and take part in it and be fully in that and be fully human. You know, I'm much more human and responsive and feeling now than I was before an awakening, because then I was uncomfortable with certain things. You shut down certain things. Now I was just saying to my friend Adyo, who I'm very connected with, and I was saying to him the other day when I stayed with them for a couple days, and I said, you know, I'm not capable anymore of shutting down. Like, if something comes up, I've got to deal with it, because that's what's there. What choice do I have? This consciousness just wants to be present to whatever's here. No matter if it's uncomfortable on a personal level or not, or whether it's painful or pleasurable or wonderful or sad or happy, and it's always this alternation, isn't it, in this life, of this human life. It's just this constant. The Buddha talked about praise and blame, fame and disrepute, happiness and sadness, pleasure and pain. Life is just this constant dance of these two, like yin and yang, just dancing. You know, yeah. Is that a hearing aid? It's something going on. Yeah, no, it doesn't matter. I just wondered.
Thank you for telling me.
Because my mom used to wear, and she didn't know when it was going. You'd have to say, "Your hearing aid's going on." You say, "What?" "Your hearing aid is going." And she'd go, "Oh, my hearing aid. Okay." Yes.
You talk about your upbringing, and it seems somewhat idyllic, actually. You know, your mother was a spiritual being, your aunt was a spiritual being. Many of us, including me definitely, didn't have this kind of wonderful, benign upbringing. Even though I was brought up Catholic, and like you, I used to go to Mass, and I used to come back from communion, press my hand against my eyes and pray to Jesus and have all sorts of visions and, well, awakenings. But over time I started to realise that the people around me certainly weren't doing that. You know, in the Mass they were sort of, you know, looking at each other and doing whatever they were doing. But I realised that what I was doing wasn't compatible with the larger group that I saw around the church, in other words, the Catholic Church.
Bless you. That was a dog. I thought it was a person. I thought, what a funny sneeze that person had. Yeah. So continue.
So my question was that for me it was very necessary to understand, to go through psychological self-understanding and go through processes where I understood why I felt disturbed and you know, unhappy and so on. And it doesn't seem to me like you don't seem to have gone through that at all. Like, did you go? Was there a period where you went through understanding your childhood programming or your,
we all go through things. No matter how nice a family we had, no matter how idyllic our life might sound, we all have heartaches. We all have various neuroses and things like that. And my family wasn't perfect. You know, my parents weren't perfect. They were pretty loving people, and I remember recently also talking to Adya, and we both said we're very fortunate, because he is a very similar, that we both had these loving parents, we both had a nice environment, we were both exposed to many wonderful spiritual people our whole lives, and neither one of us ever had to worry much about things, and that's just a fortunate karma. But it doesn't, you don't need that. Like, you get actually just what you need. Just visiting Ramana. So it's very appropriate, I think. Ramana would love that. Yeah. So we get what we need, you know. It's like the old Rolling Stones song, you can't always get what you want, but you get what you need. You know, and if we need toughness and we need some heartache and we need some pain, then we get that. And if we don't, maybe we need to be treated gently. Maybe we've gone through enough heartache and pain in previous lives and we need a gentle one this time. Or, you know, it's just different for everybody. But it's perfect for us, however our life unfolds. But we all have, I mean, like you said that about the people. When you said that, the thought that came to my mind was, well, you might be surprised. Like you said, oh, I was experiencing something completely different and I was off in my world with Jesus and they were talking about their clothes or whatever. But it's like, well, that was the way you perceived it. But if you could go into that person's heart and see what was going on, you might have been very surprised that all kinds of deep things were going on in all kinds of people that maybe didn't even appear to be going on outwardly. You know, there's an old scripture, it says that man looks at the outer appearance, or human beings look at the outer appearance, but God sees the heart. You know, this consciousness, this pure awareness, this presence of God sees into the heart of every single being on the planet. And there's all kinds of deep things going on in the heart of that little dog that just came up here. There might be something very deep in that we don't even have any inkling of. We think, oh, it's cute, the little dog came up. That dog might have been a devotee. You know, we don't know. We don't know. We think we know because we look on the outer appearance and we think we can judge it, but we can't. You know, everybody has their heartaches, everybody has their things. I've had things in the last year unfold in my life, and with my death of my brother, and all kinds of significant things that, you know, that have unfolded for me, that have brought up things from my childhood, all kinds of stuff. And we all have that kind of thing. It's all part of the juiciness and wonder of life, you know? So it's all perfect just as it is, and it all conspires to bring us to a sense of who we are on the deepest level of awakening. You know, there's an old song, do you remember this woman in the 80s? I just vaguely saw her because I was in a monastery for most of the 80s. But her name was Grace Jones, and she was this big, tall, black, kind of Amazon-looking person with just high cheekbones and really, you know, really like striking. And there's this, I remember there was this video on MTV at one point when I was out helping with my dad, and it was on, you know, MTV. You have it here, I'm sure. And they had all these beginnings of music videos. And Keith Haring, who was an artist, who did these little glyph kind of figures, little kind of stick figures. The opening of the video, he's drawing on this big, huge, round canvas. And he's drawing all these glyph kind of things, and it's all in fast motion. So it's like filling up, the canvas is filling up with all these little stick figures and glyphs and things. And then out of the center, this music comes on in the music video, and out of the center comes this Grace Jones, this big Amazon woman that looks like some statue or something, and she's singing, "I'm not perfect, but I'm perfect for you." And she just like rises up, and this big thing becomes a skirt, and it just she gets taller and taller and taller till she's like up in the heavens, and she's got this big long Keith Haring customized skirt, you know, that's coming up. But it struck me when I saw that, you know, that's the way life is. It's not perfect, but it's perfect for you. Your life isn't perfect. But you know what? We look at somebody and we think it's so idyllic. Nobody's life is perfect. We all go through things. Some of us go through less striking things, it seems, but we also then have the perception of how we feel it and perceive it. And somebody might go through very light things, and they may feel it much more strongly than somebody going through very heavy things. So maybe they're suffering even more, even though they look like they're suffering less than person A, and person B seems like, oh, they've got the life of Riley. They've got a silver spoon in their mouth. Everything's being... And they may be very much suffering because of whatever in their consciousness, you know. We're all so different. Does that make sense or kind of answer your question?
Yes, sort of.
Address it?
I'm sorry, we'll get around the idea of self-understanding as also understanding the psychological patterning that you...
Yeah, it's absolutely necessary for everybody.
Yeah, because you can be in moments of ecstasy or awakening or whatever you want to call it, aha moments or whatever. And then the next moment you can be stuck in some stuff that goes back to
that block it all.
Yeah. You were 2 years old,
yeah.
something dreadful happened, and you have this repetitive pattern.
Yeah, sure.
So the self-understanding doesn't only include the understanding of Brahman, if you want to call it being, but also
no, not at all.
The patterning that you have.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I would never say that, but you know, this is one talk. I mean, I can't put the whole truth of the universe into one talk. I can talk about one thing or focus on something, but I'm not going to cover everything. But I certainly, in my work with people, and I was a pastoral counselor, and I was a novice master, and I did all kinds of work with souls, you know, for years and years. And I know that, like, working through our issues, working through things that have been malformed in us or conditioning that's really blocking us from who we really are, we all have to work through that. And when I work with people, I often refer people to therapy. I did therapy in my life. I did therapy any number of times. And I think everybody can profit from it. So we need to, you know, the spiritual journey, I mean, the classical spiritual journey is often talked about in one certain way. But then age after age, things are added onto our knowledge, and psychotherapy and all that stuff is useful and helpful. And we need it, and we have access to it now, so we can use that as part of our journey. There's no reason to say, oh, we just want to meditate and stick with this and never look at our shadow. If you don't look at your shadow, then it'll look at you. You know, you need to deal with it. So I would never, ever, I hope, I don't want to give that impression. All of that's important, all of it. And you had...
It was kind of, actually I think you've answered it really. It was kind of to go on with the same issue. There's a word that's become quite popular now called spiritual bypass.
Yes.
Which is what you were talking about.
Yeah.
And just from my experience, having been to many Indian teachers where you were encouraged and told that you had to, if you didn't practice a lot, meaning a lot, with all this karma to overcome. So it's very refreshing to hear you being just like a normal person, like I was saying, you're enjoying life. Because my experience of a lot of Indian teachers is they may enjoy life too at their level, but it's such a different culture maybe.
Yeah.
And, I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
And, I've observed in myself as well and in other people around that it's just very easy to delude yourself. And
Oh, yeah.
if there isn't a guide there to help, it does take a long time.
That's why I think for the vast majority of people, I'll never say everybody, but for the vast majority of people, we really would do well to have guides that are competent, that have traveled the path, that have gone full circle, and they can bring us full circle. Because you're right, we can kid ourselves, we can deceive ourselves, and a lot of people spend a lot of their life trying to escape what's unpleasant and grasp onto what's pleasant, and we can carry that right over into the spiritual world. And there's a book called Spiritual Bypassing by what's his name? Is it John Augustus? Masters, yeah. And it's an excellent book. And anybody who listens to my teaching or goes to my retreats or works with me knows that I'm far from encouraging people to spiritual bypass. I'm very, very big on saying, this kind of evasion of reality in life is not what the spiritual journey is all about at all. We really have to face ourselves on that level in order to get beyond that level. We can't just ignore it and pretend it's not there and go on. If we do, it will rear its head and bite us in the you-know-where. That's what happens. So, yeah.
Because the Indian teachers don't talk about that, do they?
Well, I think probably some do. I think it's one of those things that Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, they all have their wonderful places of light and love and wonder and greatness, and they all have their weak points. None of them are perfect. There's no tradition, there's no teacher, there's no teaching, there's no scripture, there's no religion anywhere that has it all together and is perfectly balanced and has everything figured out. It's like the elephant, and they all have pieces of the elephant. The 8 blind men or whatever that are feeling different parts of the elephant. Oh, the elephant's he's at the tail. Oh, it's like this long, thin, wiry thing, and it's long and thin. Oh no, the elephant's thick and strong, and he's at the trunk. And the other one's like, oh no, the elephant's like a tree. He's like a big trunk. He's on the side of the elephant or the leg of the elephant. So all the religions and all the paths and all the teachers, including me, everybody has their limitations, and nobody has it all perfectly figured out. That's why, like what I was sharing about Buddha, Jesus, and Ramana, for me, I needed all 3 of them. They all 3 brought something else to the table that was different, that for me just filled out a wonderful buffet that was perfectly satisfying and nourishing. But I needed all of them. I needed the transcendence of the Buddha. I needed the immanence of the Christ becoming a human being, And I needed the clarity of Ramana that your being is God. That was exactly the same clarity as a 14th century English Christian mystic. So see, they all brought some other aspect.
It's very refreshing because the teachers that I've known have stressed very much the fact that Westerners don't seem to be very faithful, and that what we need to do is to learn to be faithful to one teacher and stick to that one teacher. And I was in Swami, and he used to tell this story about someone who's dying, and he's reaching up and saying, oh, Buddha help me, and then with the other arm he's saying, oh, Rama help me, and the other one saying, oh, Jesus help me. And because he's calling out to all of these people, none of them will help him because he's not focused on his one, teacher. And I, for many years, was brought up thinking like this and feeling almost guilty that I'd gone from kind of one teacher to another, So it's kind of refreshing to hear you talking like that.
Well, for me, that's my path. All I can share is my path. For another person, maybe it would be better for them to stick with one teacher and be with them for 50 years or 2 lifetimes or whatever. And that's fine. It's different for everybody. But my sense is that life gives us what we need when we need it. And sometimes it might be this and sometimes it might be that. And for me, I needed a balance of things from different sources. You know, because the Christian mystics, to me, and Jesus brought out so much heart and devotion and love. And then the Buddhist thing brought out a kind of clarity and precision and, you know, a return to mindfulness and seeing things clearly. And then for me, Ramana was a combination of those things. You know, a lot of people that talk about Ramana and non-duality now, they leave the heart out completely. But you look at the great non-dual saints and sages like Ramana and Nisargadatta, people like, they all had a lot of bhakti, a lot of heart, a lot of devotion in their lives. And I think it's an important aspect. And so you need different things are going to speak to you on different levels, you know. So I would say use what really you feel life guides you into. And like I say, it's going to unfold perfectly for you. You'll be exposed to just who you need, just when you need it. You'll see a book in a bookstore and pick it up and it'll be just the right book for you. Or you'll meet a teacher, or you'll randomly come. One woman was sharing here earlier that she wasn't planning on coming here. She's not part of this society. And then she saw online or something my connection with Adya, and she decided to come. And then felt that she got something valuable. So that's the way life happens for us, you know. It's a mystery. It's just odd coincidence after another. Coincidence.
Still on the path of the same discussion, more or less, of non-duality, the new non-duality, new Advaita. There's a lot of nowhere to go, nothing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true that if you sit down and meditate, I practice a lot of vipassana, for example. There's nowhere to go and nothing to do. It's true. But still you sit down and meditate to get to that point.
Yeah.
So what drives to get to that point? Because when you just sit, it's true. There's nothing to do. But still, something drives you to go and seek. And what is this?
I think it's your true nature just wanting to get out. It's the consciousness within you saying all this thought about I want to get what I like and avoid what I don't like, and I'm all caught up in all this conditioning. There's something deep in our hearts that realize that's not who I really am. That's not what life is really about. You know, I need to find out. I need to look. I need to investigate. Vichara. I need to investigate into life itself and find out what makes it tick, find out what makes me tick, find out what makes the world go round. You know, there's something in us, and it's good. It's a good thing. It's something within us that we yearn for wholeness. We yearn for integration. We yearn for peace. And all the time we are peace, but we don't see it. And that takes, on the level of linear time and on a kind of ordinary level, it takes a certain spiritual practice, like you say, to come to that sense. You know, but that's what meditation is. That's what surrender is. It's just being. But just being isn't so easy when we put all these other layers of things on top of just being. So I want to think about, I got to get a good partner, I got to get a good job, I got to make lots of money, I got to be successful, I got to be beautiful or handsome or whatever. You know, so we put all this stuff on top of just being, and then somebody like Ramana tells us, oh no, just get back to that being, and everything will make sense. It'll all come together for you. All you got to do is rest as being, which is Brahman, which is God. And all you got to do is do that, and then you'll see it. So on one level there's nothing to do, but doing nothing is not easy. You know, we're used to doing, and meditation and surrender is about not doing. But not doing really runs against the grain of our kind of ordinary human conditioning, doesn't it? Because we're just conditioned to want to do, and fill our world with activity and stimulation and pleasure and avoid pain, and stressful, most of human life. So there's something in us that just says, can't be about that. It's got to be something more. Does that make sense?
Still, I feel like meditation still, you are doing something, because you still sit and you still meditate, so it's still doing something.
No, you're intentionally not doing anything. Intentionally. That's what meditation is. You're deciding, okay, I'm going to just be. But most of us don't go through life just being. We add all these other things. So meditation is about stripping down to the bare essence of who you really are, which is being. You know, but on one level it seems like it's difficult because it's just the antithesis of what we normally do. You know, but if you just think life is just ordinary and just live your life and just do whatever you want and crack open a beer and watch the football, you know, well, go ahead and do that. You won't get very far. I'm telling you, you won't. This idea that you can just sit back and enlightenment's going to hit you in the head one day, well, good luck with that. I don't think that works. It didn't work for Ramana, it didn't work for Nisargadatta, it never worked for me, it didn't work for all the saints and sages of all the eons, you know. All of them had to go full in. At some point, they had to go full in and say, this is the most important thing in the world. I'm going to lay down my life to wake up. And I think it's the same today. And it doesn't just happen willy-nilly. You know, it's something we have to actually have some intention for. And, you know, if somebody else tells you differently and you want to try it, go for it and just let me know. At the end of your, you know, at the end of your life, I'm not saying you're doing that, I'm just saying if one feels that way. And you hear a lot of talk like that, but from all the great saints and sages, you don't hear that. You know, Ramana talked about practice all the time. Buddha talked about practice. Christ talked about practice. Nisargadatta talked about practice. They all, you name them, anybody. They all talked about practice. But what they were essentially saying was, practice is a being, not a doing. It's actually intentionally turning toward being rather than a kind of active, sort of in your head doing. It can be that, but that's not the true essence of authentic practice. It's stripping it back down to just a bare sense of being. That's what it's all pointing to. But like I say, that's against conditioning that we're born with and that we just seem to want to express all the time. So.
When one wakes up, what happens to the ego and thinking process?
On the what?
When one wakes up, what about the ego and the thinking process? Do they continue, or they say mind is destroyed after waking up? So how far that can be? How can the mind be destroyed after waking up?
There's different ways of talking about it. I think a lot of the misunderstandings and disagreements among people are largely semantic. You know, it's the way, the words you use. I don't talk about the end of ego, because ego, when you really look at it, ego is just a personal sense of self. Everybody in this room, including me, has a personal sense of self. Of course they do. We all have a body, we all have a personality, we all have a gender, we all have a past, we all have a future, we all have wives and children and parents and brothers and sisters and dogs and cats and jobs and all those things. All of that is a personal sense of self, ergo ego. That's all ego means. It's not a big bad boogeyman that you must chop its head off, you know. It just means a personal sense of self. So we all have that, but we just need to see that there's more to us than that. So what I talk about is egocentricity. Ego is not the problem, it's egocentricity that's the problem. There is a personal me here on some level. Yes, it's temporary, it's not eternal, it's not absolute, it's relative, it's not eternally real. One day it will end and it will all be over and there'll be no more Francis. He'll be dust in the earth. What's left of Francis on one level. But for now, it has a certain utility. It's the vehicle with which consciousness moves through life as Francis, and for some reason consciousness seems to want to do that. Don't ask me why. I don't know. But it does want to move through the world as you and as me. And so as long as we realize what that is, and we realize what that isn't, and we realize it's not the center of the universe, you know, the ego doesn't need to be destroyed or annihilated, it just needs to grow up. That's all. It just needs to realize, okay, it's not all about me. Me, I. It's not all about that. I'm part of a bigger picture. So I think what we do is we transcend the ego. We realize I'm not merely a personal self with a body and a mind. I'm infinitely more than that. I'm a vast, pervasive consciousness that permeates all that is. But that vast consciousness that permeates all that is also permeates this body called Francis. And it seems to want to do that because guess what? Here it is. And there you are. And there she is. And there we all are. And so why fight that? That's, you know, as long as we realize what it is and what it isn't. We're not limited to that. And yet that is part of who we are for now. It's a manifestation of who we are for now. And it's lovely and wonderful, like these flowers, you know. Another week, this rose will be done for. But it'll just go back into the earth, and it will nourish the earth, and it will bring up forth more roses. And right now, you know, it's lovely, isn't it, this rose? Ramana loves it. He loves getting roses. So there it is. And we enjoy it, we love it, and we realize it's limited. It's not eternal. We don't need to put all our eggs in that basket of that rose, because if we do, we're in trouble in a week. You know? But for now, we enjoy it. Same with these lives. For now, the ego's here, the personal sense of self of Francis, of whoever, is here, and consciousness is manifesting as that, and that's beautiful and wonderful. But only goes so far. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it's relatively important for now. It's relatively important to your wife, I would assume, or your children, you know. But will it be important to them 200 years from now? No. Will they be important to them? No. You know, unless they write a world bestseller that's known for 10,000 years or something. So do you see what I'm saying? It's not the ego itself that's the problem. It's the egocentricity, and I would make a distinction between that.
You mean the identification with the ego? Is that what you mean by egocentricity?
The exclusive identification. We all have a certain identification with the ego. There's no way around it. Ramana did.
Did he?
Yes, of course he did.
How do you know he did?
He was a person walking through life. If you ask him what his name was, he'd say Ramana. Or he would have said whatever it was at the beginning. What was the name? Vikaradaman? Or?
Well, but we don't know that he was identified with his ego. Do we?
I think it's impossible to be in the world and not have some remnant of identification with this body and mind. Otherwise we couldn't function. We'd be imbeciles. We couldn't walk through life and function and drive a car. And if you have no identification with your body at all, then how do you know whose car to get into when you go to work in the morning? How do you know whose mouth to put breakfast into? If I didn't have any identification, I might mistakenly put my breakfast into my dog's mouth, you know, because I don't have any identification. So it's obvious that if we're functioning in the world as human beings on one level, there's some remnant of identification left, but it doesn't mean that we're exclusively that's what I say is the difference. We're not exclusively or limited to a body and a mind, but the body and the mind and the personality and the form and the gender and all that is included in who and what we are on one level. But it's not the deepest level. It's temporary. It's temporal. Comes and goes. On the level of consciousness, that never comes and goes. And that's what awakening is. We wake up to that. But there's all kinds of myths that means then we're blown out and we don't have any mind or body or anything. And I think that's a misunderstanding. We're not attached to it anymore because we realize what's the point of being attached to that rose? In a week it'll be gone. You can enjoy it, and you can think it's beautiful, and you can water it and try to make it last as long as you want, but eventually it will die. But that doesn't mean you can't say it has some value now and you can enjoy it. The same with our human lives.
It's very hard to kind of comprehend. I mean, I can comprehend either being attached to your ego or not.
Yeah,
It's very hard.
because that's the mind. The mind wants black and white, either or. This is true, that's false. That's the mind. But in reality, truth is not either or, black and white, this is true, that's false. It's always both and. It always sees two sides of the coin. True awakening does not take some dogmatic position and say, this is true and that's wrong. If you hear that, then there's need for more awakening. And there's always need.
There are all these levels of awakening.
Yeah, there are. Yeah. But there's a lot of myth making in our minds. There's a lot of ideas about awakening means this and not that, and it means that there's no human being left and you're not a person and you're just this shell walking around and stuff. But if you went and spent a day with Ramana or a day with Buddha or a day with Jesus, I think you'd find a very rich, vivid, present personality. You look at Ramana and Nisargadatta, there's totally different people. You know, they're both supposedly awakened sages and all that, but you look at their lives, one's this gentle, kind of grandfatherly, almost maternal kind of person. This other's this angry, guy with turning purple and a vein popping out on his head. And you look at videos of me screaming at people and stuff, and yet they both had awoken to who they are on some level, but it was expressed through these very different vehicles. And just because there's some remnant of identification with that, okay, that's right now, this is the form consciousness is taking through me called Francis, that doesn't mean that I don't also know who I am on a deeper level of consciousness and presence. Both are there simultaneously. It's not, one doesn't cancel out the other. See, that's mind awakening when we think, oh, this is true and that's wrong, and this is right and this is, and it's this and not that. That's not, what is that? Duality, isn't it? Yeah, and that's what a lot of non-dual spirituality points to, this very dual thing. You know, only the absolute is real, the relative isn't real. It's like, no, they're both real. The relative shares in the reality of the absolute temporarily. It's a temporary form of the formless. You know, that's the real integrated full circle of awakening, is when you see both and together. And you get to a point where you realize all of life is like that. It's both and, it's not either or. It's not this black and white reality. Does that somewhat address? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was wondering how you understand the snake in the rope.
Yeah.
You know, in dim light, you see what you think is a snake.
Yeah.
But when you examine it more carefully, you discover that it's actually a rope.
Right.
And the snake never existed in the first place. This, as I understand it, this is an analogy of the nature of the ego.
Right.
When you realize you realize the nature of the ego, you realize it never was there in the first place, and it's no more real than the imagined snake.
In a way that's true, in a way it's not true. Again, it's not either or. It's like the personal sense of self is not ultimately real. That's where I think people, you know, I have a degree in philosophy and theology, so I think very much analytically and philosophically and so on. And where people get all thrown off, Western people, is we tend to be very, very dualistic, and we tend to think of black and white, true and false, right and wrong. And in reality, though, it's not quite that simple. It's like on one level, something can be true, and on another level, it's not true. So the relative, or the ego, or the world for that matter, is all temporary. So it's not absolutely real. In other words, it's not ultimately real, because 1 billion trillion years from now, none of it will be here in the form it is now. None of these people will be here even, 200 years from now. Nobody in this room will be alive. You know, the little personal sense of self of all these different people will be temporarily, and it'll be gone. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist at all on any level. It just means it temporarily exists. And if you look at the real teaching of Buddha, Advaita, Jesus, all of them, they'll all say, yeah, the world is, like in the Psalms it says, it's like a passing shadow, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of God remains forever. That there's an eternal reality, and there's a passing reality that's radically contingent. The only thing that keeps it in being is that it's an expression of the absolute reality that never ends. But all of it is, all of us, all these little personal selves that are made up of a body, a mind, a personality, a gender, an age, all those things, a nationality, that's all temporary, that's all conventional on one level. But temporarily it has some existence and some meaning, to like your wife, your children.
So are you saying that the ego is still a little bit yourself? Because when you realize your ultimate self, your true self, is not that the totality, what you really are ultimately, and that there is no other self?
It's what you really are.
There's still a bit of the self.
No, I'm not saying two at all. It's one. When you divide it out like that, that's when you're getting dualistic. Like only the absolute consciousness is all there is, and all these forms don't exist. I don't think that the true teaching is saying that. What it's saying is that these forms are temporary expressions of the ultimate. They're not ultimately real because they don't last forever, but they're an expression of that. That's where they get to that's where Shankara gets to that third part of the aphorism. The world is Brahman. The full circle of that aphorism is, the world is illusion. including the ego. It's all illusion. It's not ultimately real. You know, only Brahman, only the absolute, only presence, only pure consciousness is ultimately real. But the world is that. This temporary expression and form is the formless taking form. So it shares in the reality of life. It's radically contingent, is what they say in philosophy. So it doesn't have any independent existence on its own, but it shares in the reality of the absolute, and it's an expression of it. And apparently that's the way God or consciousness or whatever wanted it, because it's what we have, you know? So that's what I'm getting at. And my sense is that that is the deepest, integrated, full circle kind of understanding that eventually evolves. We go through these phases of the world is illusion, and we think, okay, that's the only truth, that's all that's real, the world is illusion, that's it. I'm done. Stick a fork in me, as they say. I'm finished. You know. So the world is illusion, and then if we're lucky, we get to the second place. Only Brahman is real. So the world is illusion, but there is this reality of consciousness, presence, God, whatever you want to call it, the absolute, that's real. But then if we come full circle, we'll eventually get to the point where we see that the world is that. The world is the form of the formless. It's the dance. That's what the Leela is. It's the play of God. All this, it's the play of God. Yeah, it's not ultimately or absolutely real, but it's sharing in the ultimate absolute reality for now. It's a dance. It's an expression of that. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, but I don't think I'm thinking about just merely form. It's not just form. It's the identification, I think.
Yeah, but it's included. That's a form. It's included.
In identifying form as oneself. And
I thought that everything is God. So you said at the beginning, isn't everything God? Everything absolute consciousness? Except this? This is excluded for some reason. Why is that excluded?
The snake in the rope analogy just has very powerful meaning to me, and I think this there's a mistake, a total mistake about the nature of yourself. And
there is a total mistake, because we're not at all what we seem. What we start out with is thinking that all I am is this. All I am is this little body, this mind, this personality, this form of this human being called Francis or Johnny or Sue or whatever. You know, that's all I am. And most people go through life limited to that's all that they are. But then if they're lucky, they wake up to who they are on a more absolute, on the deepest level, and they realize, oh, I'm pure consciousness. And for a while, that can eclipse the personal sense of things, and we can say, oh, all I am is pure consciousness. The personal doesn't even exist. It's just totally, just throw it away. It's not, it doesn't matter. But then eventually what I'm saying is we come full circle and realize the world is Brahman. And the ego also is Brahman. All of it's Brahman. All the forms that are taken are Brahman. And we're not separate from any of it, including the personal expression. So my sense is that that's a more full-bodied awakening. The other's partial. It's seeing something that's true, but it's halfway up the mountain. It's not gone all the way up. It's just halfway up. And whenever we go halfway up anywhere, when we go on a journey across England and we get halfway to our destination, when we get to the halfway point, that's as far as we've come. So we think that's the end. And for us at that moment, it is the end. It's as far as we've come. But that doesn't mean there's not more. See what I'm saying? But you know what?
Outside your position. Yeah, I do understand.
Yeah, you see it when you see it. If you don't see it, you don't see it. It's like if you go halfway across England, you see what it's like to go halfway across England. If you go the other half, then you'll see what that's like. And you can look back and see it as a halfway point. But when you're at the halfway point, it doesn't seem like a halfway point. It seems like the end, because that's as far as you've come. So, yeah, I realize, I mean, I'm not stupid. I've been in this scene for 3 years. A lot of people don't agree with this. But, oh well. I mean, it's the way I see it. I have to be honest. It's the way I've come to see it. And it makes perfect sense to me. And if it resonates with you and helps you, great. If it doesn't, fine. Do what you do, learn what you learn, and maybe I'm wrong and maybe you're right, I don't know. But I'm just sharing the truth as I see it. And if there's something in a person's heart that resonates with that, then great, follow that. And if it doesn't, then fine. Nobody has to. But I have to sing my song. I have to share what I see, and that's the way I see it. So I don't make apologies for that. That's just the way I see it. I think we're out of time because he's looking at his watch.
I'm really sorry.